A Gulf mediation plan to resolve the Yemeni crisis raises concerns about the GCC's role in regional conflicts. Activists in Yemen and now Bahrain have shunned the Gulf Cooperation Council as ineffective and are calling on the international community to intervene in their disputes. Has the GCC lost credibility, and could its regional role backfire? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Both the Bahraini and Yemeni leadership have made it quite clear they are not going anywhere soon. On Wednesday, Yemen's President Ali Abdullah Saleh refused to sign the Gulf Cooperation Council brokered deal to end the crisis. The GCC deal proposes that Saleh steps down within 30 days, transferring power to his vice president and forming a national unity government. In exchange, Saleh would get immunity from prosecution. Yemen's opposition parties, which had initially agreed to the deal, said they would not endorse it if Saleh refuses to sign it personally, whether as a ruling party leader or as a president. But the heavyweights behind the protests, the youth on the streets, accused the GCC of siding with the president against the Yemeni people. In a statement issued on Saturday, the Organizational Committee of the Popular Youth Revolution called on the United States, the European Union and the Permanent Security Council members to assume their moral responsibility and stop meddling, directed against the will of the Yemeni people to ensure freedom and democracy. Opponents of the GCC position say President Saleh has emerged more defiant than ever, reaffirming the constitutional legitimacy of his 2006 election.
وعلى إصراركم للحفاظ على الشرعية الدستورية.
I applaud you on your courage. Our people have voted for legitimacy in 2006, and they're keen on protecting it. And yes to legitimacy. No to the project of hatred from all those outlaws and killers.
Joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests in London, May Yemeni. She's a Saudi Arabian author and anthropologist. She's also the author of Changed Identities, Challenge of the New Generation in Saudi Arabia. In Riyadh, Hussein Shabokshi, he's a columnist for Ashaq Al-Awsat daily newspaper. And here in Doha, David Roberts, he's Deputy Director of the Royal United Services Institute in Qatar. May Yemeni, Saleh from Yemen, he's not going anywhere, certainly not if he can help it, is he?
The President Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen is really finished as president, and I think the GCC countries with the leadership of Saudi Arabia, who shares border with Yemen, know that, but they are not putting direct pressure on him, whether by, with the media or severing diplomatic relations, because what they want to do is secure what after Saleh. This is a country, a failing state of 23 million people at the border, and although it remains peripheral to the GCC, what the GCC really are doing, I think, is the famous sentence by Lampedusa that everything must change so everything remains the same. And the whole issue here and concern for the countries is stability. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, even stability for a country like Saudi Arabia, even if the devil brings stability, we have to deal with him. Now, what they are trying to do is find allies and someone from within the tribe, probably like the Hashid tribe, to do business with after Saleh.
Okay, let's go to Saudi Arabia now and speak to Hussein. What do you make of those statements made by May that Saudi Arabia knows that he's gone, but they're just trying to work out the best way forward now without in effect changing anything?
It's not only the Saudis that know he's gone. I think the Saudis, the Gulf countries, the international community as well as, of course, as well as the Yemenis themselves. But the important development that is taking place now is that the ruling party believe that Ali Abdullah Saleh's reign is over. I think we're seeing some voices of dissent from within that ruling party that is putting an enormous amount of pressure on the president to adhere to the conditions of the initiative presented by the GCC
but
countries.
if everyone knows that he's gone, why doesn't the GCC and the member states within the GCC aid him on his way out and do that quickly?
Well, because the devil is in the details. The control that he has over the military and most importantly over the money of Yemen, which is produced by oil and some other forms of money-making machines that he controls, he is still able to gather some crowds on certain dates to sell to the world that he still has some form of loyalty in the streets of Yemen. But the truth of the matter is that these tricks are out in the open now. People are terrified of the alternative. There's a lot of boogeymen in Yemen today. There's the Qaeda boogeyman, there's the Houthis, there's the separatists from the south, and the rebels themselves in the north, the revolutionaries that are in the streets today. The alternative in Yemen is very bleak. It has been a failed state for the longest time, and the chaos that could come out of a failed state is threatening to Oman, to Saudi Arabia, and to Yemen itself.
Okay, let me pick up on that point. I mean, David, nobody wants to see a failed state. Hussein is saying, effectively, better the devil you know, but surely that's no excuse for keeping him in power. It seems to me that the president is manipulating the GCC to keep him in power for as long as possible.
That could be completely correct, of course, but the trick is, as much as we know that the devil is in the details, but what exactly can the GCC do about this? Who exactly can they throw their weight behind, throw their money behind, throw their political power behind? I mean, there seems to be, it's extremely complex situation, even for the people on the ground over here. And there's no, standout candidate, opposing Saleh, so to speak. So they're in a very difficult bind here. And I would certainly agree with the comments that, it's only now that the GCC states are getting particularly serious about this, because serious questions of stability are coming into question here with, as my Yemeni noted, Saleh's time is up. It's a question of when, not if, at the moment. But it's just very difficult to see what the GCC states could do at the moment, I feel. Well,
the youth doesn't believe that the GCC is able to do anything, May. They've called for the international community to intervene, to take it out of the hands of the GCC.
The youth know, and the majority of the people in Yemen who are united today, whether they're Houthis in the north or the people in the south, they are united for the moment to one thing, and that is they want Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime to end and that he leaves. And they know that the GCC and specifically Saudi Arabia have backed Saleh militarily, financially, and that most of the GCC countries are not intermediaries, or except perhaps Qatar, that has more imaginary and more creative and fluid foreign policy. So the people are not really trusting the initiative of the GCC.
Hussein, there was a recent US drone attack. They were trying to get ahead of the Al-Qaeda in the region, Anwar al-Laki. They didn't get him, but they surely wouldn't be able to do this kind of attack without the permission of the government in Yemen. So do you think this relationship with the US is working in the GCC's favor or against it?
Well, I would not exactly repeat what you just said, because with what we have been witnessing between Pakistan and the United States, it tells us that the United States would sometimes go at a certain way and act in a gung-ho manner and go at it alone. We've seen it in Pakistan with bin Laden recently, and I would be willing to challenge that this euphoria that they've been feeling, that they can finish the job on Al-Qaeda, I think there are some words that were dealt with in certain meetings in the echelon of the CIA maybe, or the White House even, that why shouldn't we go after al-Awlaqi in Yemen and utilize and take advantage of a failed, miserable state of affairs in the political Yemen.
Okay, but is that making the GCC's role any harder?
It definitely does, but on the other hand, there aren't that many initiatives on the table for the Yemenis to be looking at and comparing. The GCC initiative is the most serious of all. It provides a win-win-win solution for all the parties involved. There are some, I think, other cards on the table that the GCC might go after as Plan B, i.e. the army and the tribes. These two parts have not been exercised yet. And I think Ali Abdullah Saleh knows his time is dwindling with vis-a-vis the support he's getting from the tribes or the loyalty he's betting on from the army.
David, the youth again have called on all Arab states to withdraw the GCC-backed plan. If the plan is withdrawn, would this possibly lead to more violence in the region? Could it?
Certainly within Yemen, I mean, that would be a logical conclusion, unfortunately. But in the larger picture, without the GCC plan or a variant thereof or another version of it in the near future, it's difficult to see who could step into the breach. A wider Middle Eastern group of some description, the international community, I don't particularly see them as particularly as credible, to be perfectly honest. I think what we will have is eventually, you know, we'll take a few iterations of this plan, but hopefully it will stick sooner rather than later. But I think it's the only option on the table.
Okay, very briefly, if you will, David. There's a GCC meeting on Sunday in Saudi Arabia. What do you think they are likely to do? Will they be giving him any more time? Will he be using this, the president, will he be using this again to bide more time?
It's difficult because, I mean, Saleh's used to brinkmanship within his own country, of course, but, you know, he's given a relatively good deal of immunity, as you said, from himself and his family. As part of this, and it's been rejected. So this is something of a slap in the face, of course, to the GCC foreign ministers. So, you know, hopefully they'll you know, take this and just carry on and, as I mentioned, go through another iteration. Because if they take, you know, if they take affronted by this, is what I'm trying to say, then, you know, we could have problems here.
Okay, let's pop over to Bahrain now, just to remind our viewers that on March the 14th, troops from a number of Gulf states, including 1,000 Saudi troops and another 500 police officers from the UAE, arrived in Bahrain to quell the protest. Now, this action against the protest has led to many asking why the GCC is taking sides. And now opposition activists from Bahrain have filed a case against the ruling Al Khalifa family at the International Criminal Court, accusing them of crimes against humanity. Sonia Gallego has the details.
They came to The Hague to demand what they say is justice for war crimes. This group of Bahrainis living in Britain lodging their indictment against Bahrain's royal family. They are among many who believe that the fallout from the protests still leaves them vulnerable and in danger of being detained.
I'm a Bahraini citizen and I've been tortured severely for many days and kept inside jail without a fair trial. And it is a fake trial. Just everybody in Bahrain who is calling for democracy and his right to live in Bahrain, this is banned by the regime, and the regime doesn't want to hear or to listen like what we're doing.
The violent crackdown on protesters has left many in fear of speaking out. More so when reports surfaced that a group of students who took part in opposition protests in the UK disappeared after they returned to Bahrain. They were allegedly met by security forces at the airport. Further reports of raids and intimidation on those openly criticizing the royal family have seen Bahrain's activists go quiet for the time being. But it's done little to stop some of them go to the International Criminal Court. They claim the international community is not doing enough to help them. There has been international condemnation for Bahrain's government and its use of intimidation on political activists. But Bahrain maintains that these protests are a conspiracy orchestrated by Iran. And as the uprisings across the Arab world continue, these Bahrainis may well question when they will see a resolution. Sonia Gallego for Inside Story.
May, that's a pretty fair question from the Bahrainis who've been involved in this, isn't it? I mean, will they see some kind of resolution?
At the moment, the state, the Bahraini regime, and backed by the GCC and the Saudi military, is controlling any protest in Bahrain, but at the stake of very violent of this violence that we have seen. In the short term, this is working. Now, there is a very interesting comparison if we see the policies of the GCC regarding revolutions in Yemen and in Bahrain. In Bahrain, it is about fear of the change of regime or ideas of constitutional monarchy, the use of the discourse, the sectarian discourse, of the danger that Iran brings. So this has become a geopolitical and sectarian problem. And it does have implications and dangers in this case, because Iraq, for example, was very outspoken in the criticism of the rulers of Bahrain and in support of the protesters. The GCC, of course, we know 30 years ago this month, in 1981, was established specifically to protect these countries from Gulf Arab countries, from Iran and from Iraq. There is a lot of fear from change of the regime in Bahrain, but we know that now we're talking about Bahrain and not Yemen. The real danger really comes from Yemen at the base of the peninsula.
Do you agree with that, Hussein? And do you agree that Iran is driving the response here by the GCC, and the fact that the GCC was quite willing to send troops in this instance?
Very much so, because the dissidents that were creating havoc in Bahrain were influenced, trained, and monitored to a great degree by the Iranians, because not all Shia in Bahrain were opposing the regime, or at least chanting slogans demanding the fall of the regime, because we know that the Shia who follow the Iranians, Khamenei or the Sadr in Iraq, were chanting that, but not the ones who were following Sistani or Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah.
But isn't it too easy to blame all this on Iran? I mean, the Shias have been dealt a bad hand for decades, and they continue to suffer under the leadership there.
Well, believe me, there are issues in Bahrain that both Sunnis and Shias were demanding change for. Corruption, unemployment, poverty, and what have you. But when the violence and the disruption of civil law took place and began taking a very ugly turn, disturbing the livelihood of many schools, hospitals, roads, it became suddenly a threat to the national being of that country, and it simply exercised an option it had and invited troops from a political bloc that it belongs to. This was a clear case of an external threat against the stability of that country.
David, shouldn't the GCC be leading by example here? I mean, they should be looking towards what happened as far as the Arab awakening is concerned and said, you know, we're supposed to be leading by example here. We're supposed to be encouraging change and dialogue within our own countries.
Very much. I need to pick up a few points here on the previous speaker,
Sure.
I feel. I mean, to my mind, the Iran thing is, the Iran question of Iran sponsoring all these things in Bahrain is, to a large degree, a straw man argument, to be perfectly honest. I think there's been a fundamental lack of critical analysis within Gulf states, excuse me, in the statements they've made, in the actions they've taken, in terms of the protest, as in, do the protesters have an actual case, so to speak? Not to say that, you know, the fundamental ethos and everything of the country ought to be changed, but do they have some legitimate grievances? And I'm not sure that's really been examined in the GCC. And instead, of course, what we've had is a resort, to my mind, of using Iran, as used the phrase of earlier on, of the bogeyman of the region. I mean, for sure, I'm sure that, you know, perhaps there was some Iranian influence in here somewhere. That's perhaps true, but to the level at which it has been described as a key motivating factor, frankly, I really do not see that evidence. This is not to say, of course, that, you know, in Kuwait recently, of course, there was an alleged an Iranian spy ring which was convicted in court. Sentences handed down, diplomats expelled. So I'm not ignoring the fact that Iran might be doing something along these lines, but given the reaction against it and the absolute certainty, so to speak, of GCC states in their belief that Iran is behind the things in Bahrain, I don't see enough evidence.
It seems that they're ignoring the reality on the ground, and they're not going, look what's happening in the Arab world. We need to look at what the complaints are, the grievances of our people, and do something about it, as opposed to blaming it on somebody else. And Iran always seems to be the easiest one to blame it on.
No, I would probably agree with that to a reasonable degree. I mean, certainly there's a bit, as I say, this lack of analysis of the situation, of a cool step back from it, try to take it out of, you know, the Sunni Shia lens, so to speak, whereas in fact it's been the absolute opposite. It seems to me that the sectarian question has been forced on this issue a lot more than it perhaps should have been.
Okay, May, do you think it's a problem of power and dividing power amongst GCC states? Because in the past it was always
the fear. It is the fear of the change of regime in Bahrain and the empowerment of the majority Shia in that country.
And the knock-on effect.
It is the fear of their the people's legitimate demands for democratic reform and their right as citizens, as equal citizens in that country. And that is why I have emphasized that there was the use of sectarian discourse and language and the threat of exaggerating the threat of Iran is going to have a blowback, because the demands of the people are not going to go only temporarily. This is a solution. And the use of the sectarian politics is going to deepen the divide between the Shia and the Sunni in the Gulf as a whole.
And what
this
it's
is
certainly
the danger.
done.
There is a real schism now.
Sure. What it's certainly done, Hussein, if I can pop this to you, is expose the hypocrisy within the GCC, that it's prepared to take one stance against one nation and another stance against another. Don't you think that GCC needs to now formulate what its policy is, what its position is, what its foreign policy is?
It's not a matter of hypocrisy. We have a lot of evidence to tell us that Iran has been creating havoc in the region. It has occupied islands of the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, but you have to admit as well that the Shias have a real cause of major complaint for decades, and it's been just snuffed out. And they're not going to go away. I know, but you can't blame it on Iran.
So do the Sunnis. So do the Sunnis in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Saudi, in Oman. The people who were protesting in the streets of Oman were not Shias. These were Omanis. And the issue was not made up in such a manner like it was in Bahrain. There are issues that are being demanded by the population of the GCC across the board: poverty, corruption, representation, and many others. But in the Bahraini case in particular, there were a lot of evidence of external intervention by Iran. It falls in tune with the other actions that they've been doing, terrorist activities in Saudi Arabia, Kuwaiti and Bahraini spirings, and occupation of United Arab Emirates islands. We cannot ignore the bully in the China shop, unfortunately.
Okay, if I can just
can't
quickly
use other words, but it is a case that we are dealing with.
Sure, I got your message there. David, if I can quickly ask you what you think the GCC's policy should be going forward now. There's obviously been a change in power. Used to have the Saudi Arabia at the helm. Now the Abu Dhabi's got a lot stronger, as has Qatar. Where does this leave the GCC now?
GCC is very interesting. I mean, obviously it's a group of states which are extremely similar: language, culture, history, geography, etc., etc. But even within them, and even with, you know, in inverted commas, and an enemy of sorts across the water in Iran, or at least someone whom they fear rather significantly, even under these circumstances, it's surprisingly difficult to get a united GCC line. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab and the UAE, for example, they're much more assertive when it comes to Iran. The easiest comparison with this is Qatar, of course. Qatar have a much different way of trying to deal with Iran. They try to sort of, I mean, the foreign minister was there recently, and in the press afterwards, there's always a notion of wonderful fraternal relations between the countries, and they just try to, you know, keep them in the picture, so to speak, as opposed to forming, you know, a GCC barrier against them. So it's very difficult to get a united GCC policy to Iran, or on many other things. For example, I mean, just another random example is the common currency.
David, sorry, we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
David Roberts, I feel as though we've only scratched the surface of this subject. May Yemeni in London, and in Riyadh, Hussein Shabokshi. Thank you very much for talking to us, and of course, thank you for joining us, watching this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.